It is time for another episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. I'm Dan Myler. That's Ryan McDowell. And with us this week is Matt Price once again. All three of us are on board for this episode. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, a week off in the mountains of Colorado, family vacation, whitewater rafting, all kinds of fun stuff. But certainly missed you guys and missed out on the FF Expo, Ryan. Hope that was fun too.
Oh man, yeah, that was a blast. Got to hang out with Eric Dickens, with a few other DLF folks, and meet a lot of great people from around the industry. A lot of our listeners, a lot of our supporters at DLF, and yeah, it was a great time for sure.
Yeah,
I put it on my calendar for next year, so I'm excited.
Yeah, we all really should. It sounds like it was a good time. You got to spend a lot of time with people in the fantasy industry. Most of those guys are doing redraft content every single day, especially this time of the year. And our focus as dynasty managers right now, fellas, we start that redraft philosophy kind of bleeds into what we're doing. And we see that in rankings. We see that in our ADP over here at DLF. And we certainly see that when we're looking at our dynasty rosters, right, Ryan? It's time where if you're like us, the guys that you hear every single week on this podcast, we set our lineups early in the off season. And that gives us a good idea of those guys where we should be trying to add and tinker with our lineups and get guys in there that we can add to our flex and have for those bye weeks and those injury fill-ins. So right now we're focused in on a lot of these veterans, and that's what we're going to talk about this week, Ryan. So when it comes to these veteran players that are out there, they're usually on the cheap, which is our focus of this week's episode. What is your philosophy? Are you trying to find some of these guys on most of your teams that you're thinking you're going to be a contender on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hear it all off season. Pieces of advice like don't worry about your wide receiver 2 in March, or you said you were setting lineups, but a lot of people remind us that we are not setting lineups throughout the off season. But this is the time of year where we're a week into the preseason now. This is the time of year where you should be setting your week 1 lineups and looking for those veterans, usually, because those are the players that are typically cheap in Dynasty, but those players that can really fill in those gaps, those holes at the last minute. And we know typically what we've seen is these players, even though they're basically thrown out on the garbage pile in the offseason, the closer we get to the regular season, the more value they gain. We've already seen that in our ADP, as you mentioned earlier. Some of these vets that we'll hit on today jumping 2 and 3 and 4 rounds just over the past month. And they're only going to get pricier. So look at that week 1 lineup, think about where the holes are, and maybe go shopping for some of these players we talk about today.
Yeah, we're going to try to highlight a handful of players that are on the scrap heap in most dynasty leagues, or at least low on the totem pole on the wish list of most dynasty managers. Matt, you're always an aggressive manager, and you try to compete every single year. You're also not afraid to add a veteran if you think it's going to add to your chances to go deep into the playoffs or potentially even get that championship. So what are you doing this time of year, or really throughout the offseason, when it comes to veteran players?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we are on the upslope of the veteran value curve, right? Like leading up to the rookie draft, we see that veterans, they kind of get forgotten about as everybody has rookie fever and, maybe even second year prospect kind of fever, where those guys are kind of increasing in value as we get towards the rookie draft. And then the veterans are the opposite. They kind of are decreasing in value. And then after the rookie draft, and as we get close to the regular season, they start going up in price. So I think there's some exceptions to that. Like I don't necessarily want to buy veteran running backs, in February and March. I would certainly rather wait to make sure that those guys are at least going to be somewhat healthy before we get to the season. But, the positions like quarterback and wide receivers, for example, those are positions that I will typically rather buy before those prices start coming up. And we're going to talk about a couple of those guys that have come up a little bit since even just last month. And I think that's going to continue to happen as teams continue to try to fill out the roster, fill out their starting lineups, and things like that. So certainly looking to buy, but a lot of these players we're going to talk about today, it's going to have to be the right price, So I think a lot of these are going to be holds for most people, unless they're teams that are just completely turning the switch already to making sure they're rebuilding for 2021. So it's going to be a good discussion.
Yeah, and most of these guys, like you said, are probably going to be holds, and maybe will cost a little bit more than they did a month ago. But what's nice right now, Matt, and you kind of alluded to it, everybody's still got the young player hype. That hype train is really rolling through the dynasty space. And any young piece that you can talk about can fetch you veterans and players that you can plug into your starting lineup right away, even if they're real low, third round type guys, future draft picks. And those are the types of guys we're going to try to highlight here. We spent a little time trying to identify some of the veterans. We'll try to decide if these guys are guys we're going to be actively going after and what we're going to be willing to offer a fellow dynasty manager to add them to our rosters. Let's start at the quarterback position. We'll try to get to at least a few players from each position. I think one of the best players to talk about in this exercise, Matt, is probably Aaron Rodgers. 37 years old, certainly qualifies as a veteran late in his career, or at least we think late in his career. Currently quarterback 12, according to Dynasty ADP, but our redraft brethren over there at 4for4 Football that collect ADP from across the industry, they have him at quarterback 7. So going a lot earlier, 55 in ADP, 106 in Dynasty. So we need to try to figure out, is Aaron Rodgers worth it? Just in the last month, he's gone up a couple of spots among quarterbacks from quarterback 14 to quarterback 12. So, Matt, what are your thoughts when it comes to Rodgers? We've talked a lot about his off the field stuff, but now it's all about on field in Green Bay for at least one more year with all those weapons. Is he a guy we're targeting?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's another guy we're going to talk about in just a little bit, and Tom Brady. So if we're targeting quarterbacks that are 7 years older than Rodgers, I think that Rodgers is certainly still a fine target. He's going to cost you, I think, more than a first, maybe closer to 2 firsts in super flex leagues at this point. Now that we know he's back in Green Bay, but there still is that uncertainty about what his future is going to hold after 2021. Right? We don't know if he's going to be back in Green Bay and what his situation is going to be like. But I think he's the kind of player that, just like Brady, if he goes to a new team, as long as there are weapons there, and Devontae Adams is nice, and we've got Amari Rodgers, and we got his old buddy Randall Cobb back, but outside of the top player there and Devontae Adams, we're not super excited about the rest of these weapons, I don't think, in terms of passing offense. So if he goes to a similar team where they have at least one solid weapon, I don't think we should necessarily be scared off of Rodgers for the next 3 to 5 years. So if I can get him at a reasonable price, definitely someone I'd still be targeting, especially in super flex leagues. I did pull up the trade finder real quick over at DLF. The most recent trade is actually one I think I would certainly do. You'd be sending off Carson Wentz and Michael Carter and getting back Aaron Rodgers and a throw-in piece. In this case, it was Xavier Jones. And to get the certainty of the upgrade from Wentz to Rodgers, you're giving up a little bit of a piece that people like in Michael Carter, but I think that's a big enough upgrade at quarterback to make that a reasonable deal for me.
And that's exactly what I was just talking about. The young player fever that's going throughout Dynasty. You put that name out there, Michael Carter, young running back. Everybody's after those running backs, particularly in leagues where you have to start 2 of them and you get the upgrade, right? So Aaron Rodgers, Ryan, is not a guy that anybody expects to be gone or retire anytime soon, despite what kind of happened over the last few months and maybe the news that retirement was an option, was on the table for Rodgers. He's going to be around for a while, and he seems to be, whether you're playing in super flex or single quarterback leagues, a guy that you can rely on, certainly a guy you want in your lineup every week in 2021.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I agree with Matt, despite the uncertainty when it comes to Rodgers beyond 2021, as far as where he'll play, I'm not too worried. I mean, he's not only a quarterback that has one of the highest ceilings in the league from a fantasy standpoint, he's also been maybe the most consistent. And You look back over his career, of course, he hung out on the bench for 3 years, but since then, every year that he's played at least 15 games, he's been a top 10 quarterback, and that's actually not fair. He's got one QB 10 season, two quarterback 7 seasons, and every other year he's a top 3 guy. So we're talking about 8 top 3 finishes, including last year when he was the QB3, just putting up big numbers despite what was viewed as kind of limited weapons and no wide receiver 2. With the moves they've made this year, fairly minimal, I guess you could say, Cobb and Amari Rodgers. I think that will help, and I love the price on Rodgers, especially in a 1 quarterback league. I think he's an easy buy there. You might get him. Matt was kind of talking about it. You might get him even for less than a first rounder, and he's a guy you plug in your lineup for the next 2, 3, 4 years at least.
Yeah, I like that. I like him as a buy. Another guy that if you're looking for, I guess, a shorter window, it's probably who Matt just mentioned, Tom Brady, 44 years old, quarterback 19 in DLF's August, brand new August Dynasty ADP. Over on the redraft side, 67 overall and quarterback 9. So expected to be a quarterback 1, Ryan, a guy that we can depend on every single week in the short term. But for the first time ever, Brady started talking about that R word, the retire. He can't play forever over the offseason. It is winding down, whether it's this year or next. There's a limited window, limited shelf life when it comes to Tom Brady on your dynasty roster and in your starting lineup. So how willing should we be to plug him in as a cheap quarterback 1?
Yeah, I think Brady, from a fantasy standpoint, not just dynasty, but really fantasy in general, kind of lost a little bit of his luster there late in his time with New England, and he's kind of falling out of that QB1 range. He was more of a high end quarterback 2, but that totally changed last year. I mean, the best weapons he's had in 10 or 15 years, probably, with that trio of wide receivers in Tampa Bay, plus his buddy Gronk. So I really feel like he can run it back again this year. One of his top 5 years from a fantasy production standpoint that he's had in his entire career was last year. He was the QB8. So yeah, like I said, I think we just see pretty much the same thing again this year. Obviously it's a 1 or 2 year deal for Brady, but the price reflects that.
Yeah, and again, just pulling up some trades from the Trade Finder, really reasonable deals for Brady as well. Brady for Darnold and a 2023 second. I mean, there's some argument, I think, that Brady has, if he plays 2 years and Darnold has a bag year, that Brady has more startable seasons left in him. Brady for Kyle Trask and 2 seconds. I mean, these are all deals that I think are reasonable to make. Tom Brady for a single second in a 2 quarterback league. So the two, actually it was the 2021, the 2.03 this season. So all of these deals I think are reasonable if you need a quarterback, and some of these players, again, like we're treating Brady year to year, but he could easily play 2 to 3 more seasons and far outproduce whatever price it is you're paying for him right now. And that Sam Darnold trade, I mean, you're just getting a little bit more security, I think, even for this season. We saw PJ Walker last week in the first week of the preseason game for the Panthers play pretty decently, and some people we saw where maybe there is some a quarterback controversy there. Not a controversy, so to speak. It's probably going to be Darnold, but maybe at some point Darnold stinks it up. He could lose that job. So those kind of offers, those kind of deals can get you a little bit of security, especially if you're a contender right now for at least this season, if not, 2 or 3 more seasons.
Another name that would probably come up for most when considering veteran quarterbacks that probably have more value in redraft than we do in Dynasty is Matthew Stafford, moving from Detroit to the Rams now. Better offense, better weapons, just still 33 years old, Matt. And Dynasty ADP, again, August Dynasty ADP has him at quarterback 17. The redraft community, a lot higher on him, expecting quarterback 1 numbers, quarterback 10 overall. So Stafford is another guy that we can add at a little bit of a discount if you're willing to take on the veteran in a new space.
Yeah, multiple instances of Stafford going for a single first, single 22 first in Superflex league. So another guy, like obviously, if I'm going to pay that price of a single first for a guy like Stafford, or excuse me, for a guy like Brady, I'd be willing to do it for a guy like Stafford even more so. He's somehow Stafford is 11 years younger than Tom Brady, so you're getting even more security there, and there's a little bit of uncertainty, I guess, with this offense, him coming over to LA with Sean McVay, and but I think we all expect him to do well. Outside of Calvin Johnson, he's going to have the best set of weapons he's ever had in his career, right? So if I can get Matthew Stafford for a single first, and I'd probably honestly be willing to spend two firsts if I was really in a spot where I was a favorite with the rest of my roster, if I needed to get that solid quarterback 2 option. And again, he's going to play at least 3 to 5 more years. Then I would say that's maybe conservative, especially if he's able to take down a Super Bowl here in the next year or two. Like that just seems like he's going to want to play even more, knowing the kind of guy that Stafford is and the kind of competitor he is. And if he's on a good team, why wouldn't he want to keep playing? So another very safe ad in one or quarterback leagues, and especially super flex leagues, I think.
Yeah, Matt, you mentioned the uncertainty with Stafford with moving to this new offense, and I'm feeling that a little bit too. I don't look at Stafford as quite the slam dunk that Brady and Rodgers are from a short term perspective. He has fallen off a little bit the past 3 years, a quarterback 20 finish, quarterback 15 finish. But I don't know, maybe he's on that Brady path of where we had seen him fall off due to the decline in overall weapons. And as you mentioned, now that's not going to be an issue with Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp. We'll see what happens with that running game, but I'm certainly excited to see him in this new offense. And honestly, from a dynasty standpoint, I think I would prefer Stafford even to Rodgers. So when you factor in that value gap, quarterback 12 versus quarterback 17, I like buying Stafford in both redraft and dynasty.
It does make a lot of sense. You mentioned the concerns with the Rams. Another concern is that defense. It's one of the best in the league. They're gonna try to hold teams back, and that may create a Sean McVay running game and short passing game, a little bit more of a game manager potentially for Matthew Stafford in the very, very short term, considering just this year. I think that Rams defense might be a negative. But again, if that running game isn't as strong as they maybe intended, if Akers were healthy, then perhaps Stafford will have to make up for that with his arm. We'll see how that all shakes out. It's an interesting, something absolutely worth watching. I'm looking forward to seeing how that Rams offense really plays throughout the season. Let's transition over to the running backs, guys. There are a handful of veterans, and with the quarterbacks, we talk about 33-year-old Stafford, 37-year-old Rodgers, and even a 44-year-old Brady. But when you're targeting aging running backs, it's rare that they even hit 30 years old. Let's start with Mike Davis. He's 28, Ryan, and running back 31 in Dynasty ADP at 90 overall. In redraft, 60 overall, and running back 23. So we can potentially pay RB3 prices in Dynasty for a low-end RB2. Are we willing to buy?
We are not.
That's a real short-term window here, right?
Exactly. I think we are looking at Davis as just a one-year option. I would be surprised if he gives us anything of real value or real production in 2022 and beyond. And I mean, that's probably going to be the story for most of these players we talk about today. But Davis is the one that is going to cost you a top 100 dynasty pick. If you're talking about trades, Matt probably has some for us in a moment. But I mean, potentially a late first or an early second or maybe a younger prospect. And I'm just not willing to pay that for a guy like Mike Davis, who not only is it a one-year window, I'm not even sure it's a one-year window. I mean, last year could certainly prove to be a fluke. And even looking at last year's numbers, we really like what we saw at the end of the season because he finished as a top 12 running back. But when you break it down and look at the numbers, so inconsistent. It was up and down with Mike Davis, which is really kind of what we probably should have expected from a backup running back. So I'm out on Davis at this price.
Matt, how about you?
I just don't think that the price I'd be willing to pay is a price that's going to get him. Like he seems like the epitome of a hold to me. If I was a really bad team, I might consider selling him for a second. But if I'm like, on the edge of competing or a strong contender and I have Davis, or I'm trying to acquire Davis, like I feel like I would pay a second round pick, but is that really going to get him? I just don't think so, unless he's on just on a really bad team who's completely set on rebuilding this season. So he's probably going to be a hold for me in most cases, and I might try to buy, but it would have to be a team where I already have two strong options and I'm bringing him in to be a third, to flex play on weeks where I don't have a stronger option, or, that bye week injury fill in for my top two guys. I certainly wouldn't be acquiring him if I was counting on him to be my running back 2, and certainly not my running back 1 for the season in a dynasty setup. And Dan, I think you threw, maybe even Ryan too, threw a little bit of shade on Quadri Allison last week, but he was stated to be the true backup to Mike Davis, and much younger guy. I think he's 23, 24, something like that. So if I can go get Allison for basically free and not pay a second for Mike Davis, I might take that bet that direction.
I'll just sell Mike Davis for the second. I'll take my second round pick, or some player that was drafted in the second round this year or last year, somebody that I like. I'm not buying. I'm not in on Davis being a long-term asset, even if you just look at this season for perspective. It's unlikely to happen for 17 weeks for Mike Davis, in my opinion.
So someone sent Juju Smith-Schuster to get Mike Davis.
Oh my goodness! Somebody
earlier this month, somebody said Mike Williams. I guess that's not as bad, but I think I'd probably still want Mike
that's pretty bad.
Williams. It's not as bad as Juju, but it's still bad. Le'Veon Bell and a 22 second for Mike Davis.
I'll take Bell in a second. Bell might outscore Mike Davis, and he's not in the league right now.
So wait a minute.
Ooh.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, so
you've gone too far. Let's get
too far for sure. How about we jump over to Raheem Mostert? He's 29 years old, and in Dynasty, Matt, he comes in at 104 overall, running back 36. Over on the redraft side, 78 overall, running back 29. A guy that certainly in spurts throughout his career, at least with the 49ers over the last couple of years, has really carried dynasty managers, redraft managers as well. If he's the guy out of that backfield to start off the season, which is logical, it could happen. He could be in line for a pretty nice season, but that 49ers running back core seems to rotate through week in and week out. There's a guy on IR. There's a guy missing the game every single week, and Mostert's sure to be that guy from time to time. So how willing are we to invest in Raheem Mostert, considering the relatively cheap price tag?
0, even less than Davis, to be honest with you. Mostly, I mean, if I have him on my roster, I'm happy to start him while he, is quote unquote the guy. If he ever is, it ever gets, 70%, 60% of the workload. We just haven't really seen that over the last few seasons in San Francisco. And you have a highly drafted rookie sitting right behind him. That's just an extra scary situation, I think. So he's a hold probably if I'm a contender, and he's my running back 3 or running back 4. And I can use him at the start, but otherwise, I don't think there's any chance I'm buying him. He's going to cost you probably a second round pick too, and I'd be even less likely to pay that for Mostert than I would be for Davis. If you can get him for a third, I mean, sure, I guess why not? But not anything higher than that.
I think he's a guy whose ADP is very different from his trade value.
Absolutely.
When I look at his ADP, again, he is 104 overall, RB 36. I look at the players being drafted in that range. We're talking about a player we already mentioned, Aaron Rodgers, Tony Pollard, Logan Thomas, Mike Williams, Will Fuller, Justin Fields, Irv Smith, Henry Ruggs. I want all of those guys easily over Raheem Mostert. Luckily, we're kind of focused more on trade value, who you can maybe go get. And I do think Mostert is cheaper than that ADP would represent. I think you could get him for maybe less than a second. Maybe that means you're getting another piece back in that deal, or I don't know. I think he could be cheaper even than that early second. So kind of Matt, kind of like you said, I don't mind investing. I don't mind having him on my team. You just can't count on him. That's the tough thing. And we always have to worry about injury with him. Now we also have to worry about Trey Sermon.
Yeah, and maybe not just Trey Sermon. That depth chart is full of guys that can be productive in short stretches. So again, if I can get a second for Raheem Mostert, I'm probably doing that deal unless I really, really need him. But let's be honest, guys. If you really need Mike Davis or you really need Raheem Mostert, are you really a contender? Probably not.
Maybe if we're talking like the end of the season, like towards the playoffs, like, and you've just through attrition, you've lost some guys. Maybe
that's a different conversation. That's one
absolutely.
We can have in 3 months, right? Or in 2.5 months, when we know how Raheem Mostert has looked or Mike Davis has looked. Have they established themselves? Are they holding on to the job? Are they putting up those RB2 numbers? At this point, there's too much of a guessing game and way too many red flags to just assume that Mike Davis and Raheem Mostert are going to be your RB2 for an entire season.
I think that there's one situation, and that's just if some of the leagues we play on where you're required to start one of each position and then the rest are flex. I mean, if you have just a simply stacked wide receiver room and you're going to start 6 or 7 of them every single week, and you're rolling out Mike Davis to fill your one running back spot. I mean, I could see, or even Raheem Mostert, I guess, for part of the season, I could see that, but largely, no, you're not. You should not consider yourself a strong contender in those scenarios.
How about we jump over to Melvin Gordon, 31 years old, another rookie running back incoming and looks awfully good. Javonte looks like the real deal if you watched any of that Broncos preseason game. Gordon, 115 overall in Dynasty, running back 38. Over on the redraft side, 87 overall, running back 31. So those guys, Ryan, are depending on Melvin Gordon as a flex or a third running back. It's a sketchy situation at best when it comes to Gordon, and investing in a 31-year-old running back does not seem like a good dynasty philosophy to follow.
No, it really doesn't. I mean, the good thing about Gordon here and his value, his price, his ADP, everything has dropped so much throughout this offseason. Obviously, that's mostly due to the draft pick of Javonte Williams. But I think at this point in Dynasty, Gordon is at a price that we can take a shot on him. As you mentioned, RB 38. I mean, behind Raheem Mostert, I don't know. I'm surprised that he's fallen that far that fast. I don't mind Gordon. I'd rather have Gordon than Mostert, and maybe even rather have him than Mike Davis.
Yeah, I mentioned that he's 31. That I added a couple of years onto him. He's about to turn 29, so not quite that old. Matt,
it's all the same once you're over 28.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, I'm with Ryan. He's of all the guys on this list, I think I would rather still invest in him. I know Williams is there, but Melvin Gordon was not really that terrible last year. He was, if you're talking about from a season-long standpoint, he was the running back 14, just barely outside of the running back 1 range. From a points per game standpoint, he was more like running back 24. So if Williams comes out and just takes his job, then you're certainly gonna lose out. But there's always the chance that some other team needs a running back and Williams takes over, and then they let Gordon walk for some deal that it's going to help another team, right? So I'm not as afraid of Gordon as the other guys we've talked about, at least from a standpoint of going forward from this year. I think just the name value alone is going to have him in the mix, whether it's not necessarily the lead back in the committee or something like that, but I think he's going to have some production for us not only this season, but at least one more season, maybe 2 more seasons. So if I was going to spend a second round pick on any of the guys we've talked about so far, it would be Gordon, and I'm not even sure you necessarily I would have to pay that, kind of like what we're talking about with Mostert. So if I could get Gordon for 2/3, or a second straight up, and I needed a running back 3 type, then I think I would be more willing to invest in him than either Mostert or Davis.
Yeah, I'm all right with investing in Gordon as well because of the things that we've seen in the past. He's established himself around the goal line. He can carve out a role that way. He's also a pretty good pass catcher. He could have a role in that part of the game. So even if he's a supplementary player or becomes that down the road later this season or even beyond this year, as you suggested there, Matt, there is fantasy production that goes along with those roles. There's a couple of guys in Tampa Bay, and one of them maybe doesn't fit the age requirement. That's Leonard Fournette. It feels like he's been around for a while, fellas. He's only 26 years old. Comes in at 101 overall in our Dynasty ADP, running back 35. Over on the redraft side, real close, 88 overall and 32 among running backs. Also, his new teammate, Giovanni Bernard, got a little run the other night, 29 years old, running back 57, Ryan, while on the redraft side, he's 54. Tampa Bay as a whole is tough to really navigate, tough to figure out in that backfield. There's going to be different roles for sure. We've seen that with Bruce Arians in other spaces as well. Unless he has that truly elite guy, there isn't a truly elite running back for the Buccaneers right now. So we have to try to dissect and come up with who we're going to depend on as dynasty managers. It could be Bernard. He's really cheap, running back 57. It might be Fournette again, as he was last year at running back 35. Is there a guy in Tampa Bay that you're willing to invest in if you're looking for that running back 3 type?
Yeah, it's 100% Gio Bernard. I think we saw Fournette really turn into a pretty solid pass catcher late last season as Tampa Bay made that Super Bowl run. And honestly, I think part of that was just by default, right? They didn't have a Gio Bernard type. Now they do. Now they've got that James White that Brady had in New England, and really this backfield is kind of becoming a New England situation where there's 3 guys that are fantasy relevant. It's going to be not only a tough decision right now which one we want, it's going to be tough week to week. But obviously Gio is the one with some PPR upside. And when you add in that he's also the cheapest and really by far the cheapest, it becomes an easy call for me.
Yeah, if I have to pick one of them, it would be Bernard. I think he's going to cost you about a 3rd round pick. There's several instances of that happening in the trade finder. There's also one of the safe leagues. There's an instance of Bernard getting traded for 100% of the blind bidding dollars for a year. So you don't even have to give up a draft pick in that scenario. Fournette's going to cost you a 2nd round pick. And I do think that the risk reward at that price for Fournette is probably worth it, because if Bernard isn't as involved as we think he's probably going to be, if he doesn't take that James White kind of role, then Fournette, could certainly take everything. But there are other guys there too. Obviously Ronald Jones still kicking around, Keyshawn Vaughn, so other players in that backfield. But I do think a 2nd round pick is like the perfect price for Fournette right now if you wanted to take a shot. But for me, if I'm picking between them, it's Bernard for a 3rd easily.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. What kind of muddies the water down there in Tampa Bay is Ronald Jones is still hanging around.
Yeah.
He comes in at 98 in our ADP, running back 32. Along with Fournette and Bernard, I agree with you guys. Bernard's the guy, particularly if it's full 80 or full PPR. In a standard league, it's kind of too messy to mess with. Maybe you add Bernard because running backs catching the ball out of the backfield, those yards count too. He has the opportunity to score on those catches around the goal line, but it's a little bit too murky in a standard league to really invest in any of these Buccaneers, in my opinion. Let's go to some pass catchers, guys, because there's a handful of guys that are all 30 or older that, especially when you compare the Dynasty ADP to the redraft ADP, you're going to see a big difference. And it starts at the top, relatively high. It's Julio Jones. He's wide receiver 16 in redraft, 40 overall. When you jump over to Dynasty ADP, it's 69 overall. Wide receiver 32. So he goes down 16 full spots, Ryan. What are your thoughts on Julio? Because at age 32, now in a new offense with a different quarterback, different coach, another elite wide receiver next to him, there's a lot of factors to weigh before deciding whether Julio Jones is one guy that we're willing to target and pay still a relatively high price in Dynasty.
Yeah, he's just way too high. He's way too high in Dynasty at this point. We know the injuries are a concern. I mean, even his supporters are basically admitting already that you can't expect to get a full season out of him. And I don't want to jump ahead too far, but we're going to talk about Antonio Brown in a moment, who is several rounds later in ADP. And I think they're a close comparison as far as who I would rather have on my Dynasty team moving forward. factor in that ADP difference, wide receiver 32 versus wide receiver 54. It's no comparison. That's really where Julio Jones should be, or actually probably somewhere in the middle. Antonio Brown's undervalued at this point, so they should both be maybe in the wide receiver 45 range.
In Dynasty, obviously.
Yeah.
And Matt, the price on Julio Jones, I still see it. You're paying wide receiver 3 prices, and clearly when he's on the field, we're expecting maybe even wide receiver 1 type of numbers. Tannehill's certainly a good quarterback. That offense with the play action, Julio is going to just feast because of Derrick Henry's running game. But the short-term window of what Julio Jones can give you, considering the price that Ryan was talking about, it just seems ridiculous.
Well, I think this is another player where the trade value doesn't match up with the ADP. Sure. I think from a draft standpoint, yeah, I'm probably not taking Julio, a 32-year-old wide receiver in the 6th round, right? But from a trade standpoint, multiple instances again in the trade finder, all recent of going for a 2nd round pick, 2.04 in 2021, Michael Carter straight up for Julio Jones, a second and 2 seconds, 1 in 22 and 1 in 23. Darius Slayton and oh, that's not a good one. I'm not doing that. I thought it said 4th round pick, but it says Darius Slayton and a 1st round pick. That's not a good one. So I don't know. I think he is a reasonable trade target. And several years ago, I wrote an article series at DLF called the Rolled Strategy, WR Old. And that's basically what this is. We're going to talk about all these guys on this list, but you can build a sustainable wide receiver core from these old cheap guys that are going to produce in 1 to 2 year windows for you. So from a trade standpoint for Julio, I don't mind paying a 2nd round pick, especially in 2022 for someone like that. But I'm certainly not paying that price in a startup.
I don't think a second gets Julio Jones though. It doesn't feel like it, does it?
Argue with the trade finder. Argue with the trade finder because there's lots of instances.
The people that have Julio Jones on their roster, they like Julio Jones in the leagues that I play in. It feels like so. I guess I can get on board with that if it fits your team, but. I was looking over our ADP, and the guys around him are guys like Jerry Jeudy and Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle and Rashad Bateman. And I know what you're saying where ADP and trade value don't add up. Those guys are 1st round picks.
Yeah.
And, so something doesn't add up to me. It feels like the Julio manager in your league is a huge Julio fan, most likely. How about Adam Thielen, another 30-year-old wide receiver? He comes in at 78 overall in Dynasty ADP and 38 among wide receivers. In redraft, he's at 49 in wide receiver 20. So again, Matt, we're expecting wide receiver 2 numbers at the very least, I would say, and only have to pay wide receiver 4 prices in this case. Couple years younger, has the same kind of reputation as a playmaker, scored double-digit touchdowns just last year, has another elite wide receiver in that offense, a good running game. Everything kind of lines up for Thielen to have 1 or 2 more big-time seasons, potentially even back-end wide receiver 1 type seasons. Are we willing to invest in this guy?
I think again, it's about the same price, and from a trade standpoint, it's going to cost you a 2nd round pick and another older wide receiver that if you have a hole in your starting lineup that you can go out and get fairly cheaply. I do think we're going to see, I don't think we're going to see 14 touchdowns again from Adam Thielen in 2021. So I don't think that's going to happen. He was just under, I guess about 925 yards last season. I think that's about the right range. So if we're talking 900 yards and let's even say half those touchdowns, 6 to 7 touchdowns, I think that could be okay for a 2nd round pick. But if I can get Julio Jones for a second as well, like I know that there's a big a couple year age difference there. I think I'd probably rather go get Julio if I have to pay that same price. And I think that same thing will go for Antonio Brown and maybe a couple other guys we're talking about on this list. So, I don't mind the price tag, but I think you just have to look around and see what else you can get for the same price. If you can't get Julio for a second and you still need a wide receiver, sure, go get Adam Thielen for a second.
See, I feel like there's a chance you can get Thielen for a second, but Julio, trying to get into that other dynasty manager's frame of mind, it seems unlikely to be. But you guys would know better than me.
Dan, let me remind you that you and I on a team that we managed together were offered Julio Jones for a 2nd round pick and turned it down.
Well, just because I said you can't get it doesn't mean I wouldn't do it, or should do it, or vice versa. You're right.
It's obviously roster dependent, but yeah, like that's
right,
just an example. Like,
exactly.
yeah.
Well, I mean, back to Thielen, and I don't want to base everything on Julio Jones, but I can't believe he's behind. I can't believe he's behind Julio and ADP. I totally disagree with Matt. I would much rather have Thielen. And I mean, looking at this ADP, I guess I've kind of, I don't know. For me, Adam Thielen has maybe fallen through the cracks a little bit this offseason. Not a player I've really spent much time thinking about or studying or anything, but the ADP is staring me in the face now as wide receiver 38. He's been a top 10 wide receiver 3 of the past 4 years. Matt, I agree with you. Some of those touchdowns are going to shift over to Justin Jefferson. We've talked about him despite his crazy productive season from a year ago. Didn't have that many touchdowns in comparison to his yardage and his overall production. So I do think some of those will shift. We can expect a step back for Thielen, but for that price range of a second or a startup ADP of 78 overall, he's got to be one of the biggest buys in Dynasty right now.
Yeah, I mean, I really completely agree with that. Go ahead, Matt.
I just think that that finish that you talked about from last season, 3 of the last 4 seasons, like that. I mean, last season was propped up completely by those touchdowns. The yardage just wasn't there. The targets were down. We haven't seen more than that 108 targets since 2018 at this point. That was his big breakout. Well, that's not his breakout season, but his second big season back in 2018. And, 2019 was obviously a little bit injury plagued, only played 10 games. And then last season, again, propped up by those touchdowns. But if we think that Jefferson's going to continue to take a step forward, I don't know. I think you can make a case for him over Julio, but I'm still taking Julio over Thielen at this point.
I mean,
yeah, you mentioned his numbers being propped up by those touchdowns. He scored in all but 5 games last year, guys. He was very consistent when it came to finding the end zone. Multiple 2-touchdown games, in fact, 4 of them throughout the season, and really only busted a couple times. There were a couple 3 for 27, 2 for 38 games. Other than that, there were some 9 catches for 80 yards when he didn't catch a touchdown. So he was productive throughout the season, finished as a wide receiver 1 in both half PPR and full PPR leagues. And I know the touchdowns likely won't be 14, but I wouldn't be surprised if he flirts with double digits once again. And that's going to keep him in the top 15 among wide receivers. I think there's a chance that maybe even redraft ADP. I mentioned it before, 49 overall, wide receiver 20. That might even be low for Adam Thielen. So I like what you said there, Ryan. He's slipping through the cracks.
You guys
we don't want our friends over at Monkey Knife Fight to slip through the cracks. We got to talk about them. I'm so glad that we are once again teamed up with MKF, the fastest growing daily fantasy site in the world. Instead of spending your time building elaborate salary cap rosters or competing against professional players, you can explore unique, fun, easy to play games like More or Less, Knockout Kings, Eagle Eye, Goal Rush, or Touchdown Dance. Play any of the major sports such as the NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB, as well as UFC, NASCAR, golf, soccer, and various college sports without competing against the Sharks. Right now, you can open a new Monkey Knife Fight account, make an initial deposit, and get a full year of DLF Premium for free. On top of that, if you use the promo code DLF, Monkey Knife Fight will match that deposit 100%, doubling your initial funds. Simply log on to dynastyleaguefootball.com, click the image for Monkey Knife Fight, and follow the instructions to get started today and get that free DLF subscription. Let's talk about Antonio Brown, Ryan. You mentioned him before. He's 33, wide receiver 54 in DLF, Dynasty ADP at 116 overall, up at 96 overall in redraft at wide receiver 40. I think that might be a little bit low. You maybe elaborate on that a little bit more if you want to. Even wide receiver 40, that offense is going to keep slinging it. There's a good chance we can expect wide receiver 3 numbers at a minimum from Antonio Brown in an offense with Tom Brady coming off the season that they came off last year. Remember, he didn't come on till late last year. And when he did, came on like gangbusters. We were using him in our lineups last season. He's back again. What are your thoughts on AB? You're muted.
I think he's totally undervalued, as I kind of alluded to before. The wide receiver 40 ADP in redraft is a little better, Dan, like you said, but still maybe leaving a little meat on the bone there. He played 8 games last year. What I thought was really interesting, it's easy to look at his numbers. I wanted to look and see what he did to Mike Evans specifically. When in the first 8 games of the season, Mike Evans was averaging just over 17 fantasy points per game. That dropped to 13 and a half when AB joined the fold. And I mean, the relationship between Brown and Brady is pretty well documented at this point. He clearly likes throwing to his guys, whether that's Gronk in the red zone or whether it's Antonio Brown all over the field. So in the short term, I think this is not great news for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And again, Antonio Brown's an easy buy at this price, whether we're talking trade or startup ADP.
Brown's last 3 weeks in Tampa Bay of the regular season last year, 5 for 93 and a score, 4 for 35 and a score, 11 for 136 and 2 touchdowns. Matt, if you're adding a wide receiver, one of these veterans at a discount, is Antonio Brown the obvious choice?
Absolutely. And Ryan mentioned the price. I mean, you look at the trade finder and it's just littered with just like head scratchers, like Antonio Brown for 2 third round picks, Antonio Brown for Eno Benjamin and Philip Lindsay, Antonio Brown for a single third round pick, Antonio Brown for a 2023 third round pick, and Antonio Gandy Golden. I mean, it seems like an absolute no brainer. If you go out and if you really just want to get the deal done, we were just talking about offering a second for Thielen and Jones. I bet if you went and sent a offer for a second to Antonio Brown owner right now, and he's not like just like the top 3 kind of contender in that league and isn't counting on him, you're going to get that deal done. So absolutely, I think Antonio Brown might be the biggest buy of this entire exercise that we're doing today.
Brown averaged 7.8 targets per game last year. Godwin 7.0, Evans 6.8. So big, like you said, Ryan, he's got the eye of Tom Brady, and who has the eye of Tom Brady is a guy we want in our lineups in Dynasty or redraft. How about Marvin Jones, 31 years old and super cheap, Matt. 140 overall in Dynasty, 118 in redraft, wide receiver 61 in Dynasty, wide receiver 50 in redraft. He played the other night with Jacksonville. Young quarterback Trevor Lawrence was targeting Marvin Jones. Looked like there might be a connection there. He might rely on the veteran. There could be some wide receiver 3 type potential when it comes to Marvin Jones in Jacksonville. In fact, he may be the wide receiver to have in your lineups down there this season.
Yeah, and a third round pick gets him. And I mean, just imagine a world where you have 2 stud running backs, Christian McCaffrey, throw in whoever you want as the second one, but your wide receivers are a little messed up. You're not quite there yet, but go throw a second round pick to get Adam Thielen, a third round pick to get Antonio Brown, another third round pick to get Marvin Jones. Now, it doesn't feel great on paper for a dynasty team, but that's a team you can compete with if you're set it out everywhere else. So Marvin Jones, I think, is probably going to lead that team in targets. I think we have questions about DJ Chark after he had one good season. The last season was a disappointment, and now it seems like Urban Meyer does not like him very much. I love Laviska Shenault, but Marvin Jones is the veteran coming in. He's the only real true veteran receiver on that is going to be able to not only teach those young guys about what's going on, but is going to be a security blanket kind of threat, I think, for Trevor Lawrence. So easy buy for a third round pick on Marvin Jones.
Totally agree. Once again, from week 10 on last year, Marvin Jones was the wide receiver 7. So pretty impressive. We're talking about almost half the season that he was putting up monster numbers. He has always been that type of receiver that is streaky, that is hot. He'll put up that 3 touchdown game. He gets one every year, it seems like. So not a guy that I want to be my wide receiver 1 or 2. He's that wide receiver 3 or flex guy because he's gonna throw some clunkers in there, and those have been tough to project year over year. But again, you cannot argue with the price. And if that's what you need, if you need a flex, if you need even just that depth wide receiver, maybe you're not planning on starting him early in the season, just using him for depth and insurance.
I would not be surprised if he was a wide receiver 2 and is the most productive wide receiver in fantasy this season in Jacksonville. Laviska Shenault, wide receiver 33 in Dynasty. DJ Chark, wide receiver 36 in Dynasty. And Marvin Jones all the way down there, as I said, at wide receiver 70. Could be the steal of your startup if you still have that coming up. Let's talk about, well, guys, there are a handful of other wide receivers that we could mention. Let's just kind of jumble them all together. T.Y. Hilton, 31 years old, wide receiver 71 in Dynasty, wide receiver 54 in redraft. Emmanuel Sanders, 34 years old, now in Buffalo, wide receiver 85 in Dynasty at 58 in redraft. That seems like that could be a little bit high. And then AJ Green, 33 years old, wide receiver 72 in Dynasty, wide receiver 62 in redraft. So let's talk about all these guys. Green is one of the guys that really moved up. He was wide receiver 91 last month and all the way up to 72 this month. Ryan, out of these three guys, is there somebody that you're targeting? Is there somebody that you're happy to give up for a third round pick or whatever you can get? What's the scoop with these three?
Yeah, we were getting a little deep with our wide receiver love. Go buy Thielen and Brown and Marvin Jones, but it kind of ends here. I'm done with T.Y. Hilton and AJ Green. I really don't want any part of them. Despite the offense that Green is now a part of in Arizona, we think of that as a high-powered offense. It really wasn't, honestly, last year. Maybe that changes this year, but I think he's the third option there at best, and another guy that we're worried about his health. So I'm out on Green, out on Hilton, the quarterback situation, the offense in general. I have concerns with Manny Sanders, the cheapest of the three. He's the one I want.
How about you, Matt? Anybody here you want?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. If it's going to be one of them, it's going to be Sanders. I love T.Y. Hilton as a player, but now with the quarterback situation in question, like I don't know. I think I'm completely out on him. And Green, I was trying to kind of hold the torch for him earlier this season when we were doing mock drafts, drafting him in like the 20th round of our DLF startup mocks, but I just don't see it now, especially with Rondale Moore there. And I don't really see what he offers that DeAndre Hopkins doesn't. So why are you going to target Green over Hopkins? I just don't see it.
I traded AJ Green just the night before KJ Hamler caught his long touchdown straight up for KJ Hamler. So that's maybe why I wanted to talk about AJ Brown. Excuse me, AJ Green. Holy cow, again, I do that so often. Couple tight ends worth talking about. Let's get right to them. Ryan, Jared Cook, the first one that we need to mention, 34 years old. You've talked about him multiple times this offseason that, if he latches on, he's probably going to latch on somewhere that he can be useful. That certainly happened with the Chargers. Tight end 26 at 203 overall in Dynasty. Tight end 19, 146 overall in redraft. So there's a little bit of upside, certainly, with the young quarterback and the offense that is expected to be pretty good. And honestly, an offensive line that has gotten a lot better over the last couple of years. Jared Cook could kind of maneuver his way into being that big red zone threat and potentially being that guy that we can plug into our lineups and maybe get low-end tight end one numbers.
Jared Cook just keeps hanging on, keeps finding elite quarterbacks to be paired with, and sometimes it's worked and sometimes it hasn't. You guys remember the Green Bay experiment, but in this case, I think it's good news for Jared Cook and really for Justin Herbert as well. And outside of the top 200, it's a pretty easy investment to make.
Yeah, almost free for Jared Cook. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of want to believe in Donald Parham or Trey McKitty, but they did bring in Jared Cook, right? So you presume that he's going to be the lead guy there at the tight end position for Los Angeles. So I definitely don't mind buying him. He probably get him for an early third round pick, late second, something like that. And if you really need a tight end, I guess you could go that way. I just think there are so many players around him and a little bit above him that don't cost that much more. And you get a little bit more long-term security. So I can see buying him. I think he's in a great offense. I think he's going to be just fine this season, maybe even low tight end one numbers. But I think there are other guys I would rather invest in for about the same price.
Yeah, we mentioned that a lot of time these veterans are moving up in ADP. Jared Cook actually moved down from 182 down to 203 over the last month. So people are forgetting about Jared Cook, but he's a guy that certainly will have tight end 1 weeks on the weeks that he scores touchdowns, of course. The last guy we should talk about here, Matt, is Rob Gronkowski, another Buccaneer worth mentioning, another aging guy, 32 years old, of course, 167 overall and tight end 22 in ADP from DLF Dynasty ADP. And then on the redraft side, 115 overall. So 50 picks higher and 8 spots higher among tight ends at tight end 14. Rob Gronkowski seems like he's going to be another guy that we can get tight end 1 numbers out of a lot of weeks, and he's relatively cheap still.
Yeah, I mean, this is true about a lot of tight ends in this range, and even some quite a bit higher than him. But if you're going to plan on starting Rob Gronkowski, you're hoping for a touchdown or one of those mega 2 touchdown games that he sometimes has at this point in his career, right? But you have to think about it. He's in the passing game. He's the 4th option at best, and maybe the 5th if you want to throw Gio or one of the other running backs in there. So he's literally going to be a dart throw every week. You're going to be, I think 1 or 2 catches for less than 50 yards in most weeks. And then the weeks that you get the touchdown, you'll be happy. But otherwise, again, if I'm going to pay, around the same price, I would rather have Cook, who is, like you said, about 40 spots cheaper in ADP. So I think I'm probably out on Gronk. If I have him on my roster, I'm happy to hold him. But if anybody wants to come buying him from me for anything more than a 3rd round pick, then I'd take it. I'd get out.
I'd rather have Cook too, but I think you're underselling a little bit the season that Gronk had last year. He had, excuse me, he did have 7 games as a tight end 1. Only, I believe, 8 players had more than that. So again, we're talking low end tight end 1 numbers overall, but still pretty impressive for his age and for his role in that offense, where really he is going to be he's going to be the 4th option at best in the passing game.
And he did catch those 7 touchdowns last season, all later in the year. Remember, he was not a factor the first few weeks. So from week 6 on, caught 7 touchdowns, had most of his, in fact, 37 of his catches and just over 500 yards in that stretch as well. So came on better as the season went on, got more comfortable in Tampa Bay. I expect him to have a similar season as last year, but a little bit more consistent without that slow start, and potentially pick up on the numbers. 45 for 623 and 7. That could be 50 plus for 708 touchdowns this year, and that makes him a tight end 1. At those prices, Gronk doesn't seem like such a bad investment. That's going to do it for this week's episode, guys. We're buying these veterans. We're trying to pay the cheap price, of course. Anything else we're doing as the preseason plays out and we're starting to think about setting those week 1 lineups, Ryan? Mute.
We're just praying that our stud players don't get hurt. That's really what we're doing mostly.
Yeah, that's good. Some of the coaches are helping us out with that by keeping those guys off the field. But we are seeing some of the bigger names. I saw Clyde Edwards-Helaire get carries the other day and thought to myself, oh boy, we can't have that, especially for those of us that invested in him last year. Matt, anything for you?
I would just say, this was really mostly buying veterans for contending teams. But at this point in the offseason, if you're a middle of the pack team or worse and don't think you have really a path towards competing, this is the time when those competing teams are looking to buy players like this and get their lineups and their rosters set for the season. So it's a great opportunity for rebuilders as well to get out on those players that are not going to help you really the rest of their careers, right? So be looking for those opportunities too on those teams that aren't necessarily competing in 2021.
The only thing I might add to that, Matt, is that if you have a guy like Julio or Thielen or Antonio Brown, really any of these guys, and they have that kind of upside, you may get more closer to the trade deadline in week 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 when Thielen has 8 touchdowns and somebody really needs that guy to put him over the top.
True, but also I don't want those points on my roster making my draft picks worse.
And you run the risk of Thielen going down to injury and getting nothing, of course.
And then you get nothing, yeah.
All right, so week 1 of the preseason is in the books. We are chugging closer and closer to week 1 of the regular season. Can't wait to do that. I hope you stick with us throughout the rest of the preseason and into the regular season here on the DLF Dynasty podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again next week.